This is Heroes for Freedom. I'm Rick Robison. Poor-born peasant kid who helped save our world. Francis and his men knew they were heavily outnumbered, but these fighting men also knew that their commander had a plan, one that would sow panic among the heavily armed Spanish galleons that they faced now. He called to his sailors, called them around him, knowing that they were good men. He said, I know your heart, men. You've stood by my side on every sea and every land that we've trod, he said. He locked eyes with nearly every single one of them. Finally, nodding once to his boys, he said, prepare the hell burners. A line of fire ships, all stuffed with flammables, especially oil, old canvas, and gunpowder, spread out tactically, aimed directly at the Spanish Armada that was coming at them. A wooden galleon loaded to the gills with combustibles, canvas, oil, of course the prime volatile combustible of gunpowder. This was any sailor's worst nightmare, in fact. And for the Spanish enemy, making matters worse, a storm had come up. So the usual procedure in a storm, of course, with these sailing ships, particularly in shallow waters, was to drop anchors and batten down the hatches and then ride out the storm. But when Commander Francis Drake saw the enemy's predictable actions, he smiled to himself. His plan was working perfectly. For it would take the enemy ships way too long to raise those anchors and escape the hell burners bearing down on them now. Commander Drake gazed up in the blackening sky and shouted, Lord of heaven, thank you. Once more you've ridden to England's defense. He slammed his fist down on the ship's gunwales. Captain Drake jumped into action. Forward, men, he said. The sailors who remained aboard these fire ships, they were all volunteers. For such a mission meant that many of them would not come back, especially on rocky seas. But Captain Drake knew these men. They were heroes all, and they would give their lives, if necessary, to protect fair Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, and the island kingdom they called home. But more so, in truth, these men loved and respected the warrior who led them, refusing to abandon their captain in such a dangerous yet pivotal moment in history. In fact, we were talking about the perfect soldier of fortune who was anything but perfect. Francis Drake was born on a farm in Tavistock, Devonshire, England. The exact date, of course, is lost to history. During the mid-1500s, a poor infant, and he was from a poor family, a poor infant's birth date was usually not recorded. Often they weren't even named for a while. Many, perhaps half of these children being born, did not survive their first year. Infant mortality was that high. But this little lad was a fighter. He was also the eldest son of a Protestant family of 12 sons. As was the practice among peasant families, the daughters were rarely mentioned. The sons were written down to some extent later, usually in the family Bible. They were driven from their farm during one of many Catholic-Protestant clashes, which nearly always turned lethal, and they plagued England during this period, 1500s, 1600s, and further impoverishing the impoverished. But Francis Drake would not allow his lowly beginnings to hold him back. No, he was smart and strong and earned what he and his family needed by going to sea. He grew in stature, and he also became more wealthy. He found himself, as he got richer and more successful, hated by local officials, particularly lesser bureaucrats. They were always worried about their status and position, of course, with the crown. Officials who served the English crown, or at least tried to appear to be serving them, but also upper and mid-level bureaucrats, civil servants as well, for all of them knew that Francis Drake was poor-born. He was of lowly peasant stock, yet somehow he had leapfrogged these jockeying administrators, receiving honors, appointments, and unheard of wealth and power. He seemed to always return from the sea with more and more gold and prestige. In essence, he was acting like a nobleman when he had no right to do so in their minds. Worst of all, with his latest return from a distant journey to the Spanish Main, having plundered a treasure-laden galleon, these Catholic enemies of the Protestant Queen, which were the Spanish, of course, he'd suddenly stolen the admiration of Queen Elizabeth herself. Surely, these officials, these ministers clamored among themselves. Francis Drake did not understand the principle of hierarchy, the rule in every society in world history, the order that a poor-born man should never be allowed to rise above the station he was given in life. It was God's will, after all, that he be born in this status. Besides, such a man made everyone around him look bad. The people of quality disliked the man for having risen so high from such a lowly family. said Gonzalo González del Castillo, a Spanish diplomat, in a letter back to King Philip of Spain, who, of course, was planning to attack England, wanted to know who they were facing. Interesting insight. But Francis Drake became the Virgin Queen Elizabeth's man. None of this bureaucratic chatter meant a thing to Francis Drake, in fact. For this indispensable, truly unique hero from Western civilization's illustrious past would go on to he'd smash every barrier. He'd steamroll his critics and those who tried to stop him. And he did it without mercy, in fact. Drake would win some of the greatest, most timely, and significant freedom-saving victories in mankind's history. But as well, he would be blamed for some truly devastating personal and professional failures. But in truth, Francis Drake was the most imperfect, perfect man. And to his credit, unlike many today, I think, even, he was a man who seemed to understand what that meant. He was also considered by some historians as the founder of the British Navy. He was the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, sailing entirely around the world over the course of an adventure-packed, 3-year, often deadly sojourn. His most significant accomplishment, however, is one that is seldom recognized by historians, which we hope here to correct, for sure, committed by an academic world that I think really should know better, especially in the case of this story. It's amazing. He would end up saving the Christian West and changing the world history forever, and history of the United States. Not directly, but certainly indirectly. First, we must say, however, that both Francis Drake and Queen Elizabeth need to share the following accomplishments. And as you will see, historians who are tuned in agree that as a team, Drake and Elizabeth stood firm against the most powerful dictatorship and war machine of the age, and emerged not only unscathed, but vastly more powerful and respected. To understand the significance, in fact, of such a history-changing victory over tyranny, again, we return briefly to the beginning of Drake's life story. In fact, as we look at this story, too often all a hero needs is the opportunity to shine. As a teen, Francis Drake was capable and courageous, certainly. And as mentioned, he jumped at the chance to go to sea at the age of 17. There he worked hard to master the skills of a mariner. And thanks to a wise mentor in his life, soon he was leading men and even captaining his own ship. For a while, when still young, he worked on a slave ship, which at the time was considered just another part, a lucrative, though always disgusting part, of maritime operations. But according to several experts on Drake's life, he rejected slaving on moral grounds right up front. He found it distasteful, in fact. Later, he would free black slaves he and his men found being held by their Spanish enemy. But Francis Drake was never a moralist. No, it just wasn't him. He was pragmatic. He was a doer and a fighter. He understood the world to be harsh and absolute. To survive such a world, a man can never, ever show weakness. Courageous yet focused, work produced results. That's what he did. He got the job done. It's important to remember that history must be judged strenuously and within historical context. Francis Drake's early years found him attacking and plundering many Spanish treasure galleons, tons of silver and gold being brutally extracted from Spain's new interests in the Americas, as they were in mostly Central and South America, but also in North America. He became a rich man himself, while also enriching Queen Elizabeth and the English crown. During one such raiding mission, he and his ship found themselves far up the west coast of the Americas, exploring as far north as what would become the state of Washington, lands never before visited by Europeans. Hunted continually by the Spanish, with a price on his head and thinking it unwise to sail back through Spanish-controlled waters, he made the bold decision to turn his ship due west and return to England through Asian seas. Why was this so incredible at the time? Because it had only been done once before by the Portuguese explorer and ship captain Ferdinand Magellan, who actually never made it home from that trip. He was murdered in the Philippines by hostile tribesmen. But more so, many believe that the vast waters of the Pacific held horrible monsters and natural traps and hazards that would swallow up a wooden vessel. While Columbus had unlocked the Atlantic, it still required courageous adventurers to finish opening the majority of our planet that was covered by vast oceans. Drake and his loyal crew wanted to prove their mettle, thumbing their nose at the Spanish enemy and honoring their queen and nation all in one grand voyage clear around the world. And after that 3-year journey, when arriving home, Francis Drake was knighted Sir Francis Drake by Queen Elizabeth and made second in command of her fledgling but growing British Navy, and of course further infuriating the Queen's ministers and hangers-on. There was no time to lose, however, for the worst possible threat was rushing their way from the most powerful army and navy on earth at the time, the Spanish Empire, encouraged by the Pope's anger over the growth of the Protestant faith in England. But more so, I think King Philip II of Spain, he saw the English and this feisty Queen Elizabeth as Protestant rivals to his global domination. And at the same time, there's a little-known fact from history. King Philip had an obsession, I think, with Elizabeth. For a time, before this period, King Philip II had actually courted the Virgin Queen. But when that didn't work out, for a variety of reasons, I think mainly because of increased religious strains, Philip began to view the budding English female sovereign as a threat to his power and certainly to his ego. Philip called his advisors around him and concocted a plan, a grand plan, using his vast wealth, coming in tons of gold and silver, of course, that they've been harvesting in the Americas, to build a fleet, the Spanish Armada, a force greater, more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. It would take more than a year to accomplish his schemes, but then he'd sail his massive army to the shores of England, and he would conquer the island nation. He would hang the Queen and her knavish privateers and redeem his honor. Few people the world over have ever been taught the overarching significance of the heroic actions of Elizabeth I and Sir Francis Drake for creating the environment that inspired and made possible the religious movements and later the economic and political environment that would become the successful 13 British colonies, and then finally, following the Revolution, the United States of America. We must first define, however, what would have likely resulted with a Catholic victory over Elizabeth and the British Isles in 1588. History, my friends, is so often about timing. Had the Spanish destroyed Elizabeth's and Drake's fleet and been able to successfully invade and conquer England, considering the absolutism of the Spanish and the tyrant King Philip II, this would have ended the budding Elizabethan era in England in its infancy. Yes, all that resulted, and we're talking Shakespeare and the arts, discovery and invention, free and open commerce, investment, banking and finance, Protestant thought on Bible access, and individual liberty, all of it would not likely have arisen. Certainly, if in its Protestant infancy, Elizabeth and England had been conquered by Spain, you would not recognize your world today. In fact, you would not recognize yourself. Now let's return to the battle, as we were speaking about at the first of this presentation, and why it took place, and what the outcome and what that outcome means for us today. In 1587, Elizabeth executed her cousin and heir, Mary, Queen of Scots, known by history as Bloody Mary, the most Catholic queen, she was called. Elizabeth, a Protestant, a strong Protestant, had Mary executed for treason. Of course, treason is always a catch-all crime that was easy to accuse someone of and difficult to defend against. We saw that with Joan of Arc and the way that she was convicted and executed. Of course, Mary, Queen of Scots, was very different than Joan of Arc. It wasn't like, Mary was an innocent monarch. Of course, she was not. She had brutally murdered hundreds of innocent Protestants. She'd burned them at the stake, in fact, and during her reign simply for rejecting the Catholic faith. Her execution by Elizabeth enraged the Catholic world, including the Pope, who determined to kill Elizabeth and return England to Catholicism, no matter what it took. So the Pope's ally, King Philip of Spain, as mentioned, began building and fitting a large armada of warships to invade England. With a skilled spy network throughout Europe and always preemptive and prepared to defend her throne and faith, Elizabeth I gave Sir Francis Drake a secret order if he could preempt and disrupt Philip's war plans. They weren't ready. England was not ready for the Spanish Armada yet. They needed to do something. She wanted Drake to descend on and destroy the unsuspecting Spanish fleet while it was still in port and unprepared. So on April 12, 1587, Francis Drake, commanding 21 warships, moved out of Plymouth Harbor heading south. At the same time, Elizabeth purposely covered Drake's departure by sending a false report to the English ambassador in Paris, who she knew was a spy for King Philip. He was being paid, that ambassador, English ambassador, was being paid by the Spanish. She knew that, but she was using the man still. And she said in that message that Drake was sailing to France, so that Drake's raiders could secretly sail directly and safely to Spain without being intercepted by Spanish galleons on the open sea, where the big, heavy galleons, heavily armed, were very difficult to fight against in such a situation. Once Drake had departed, Elizabeth also sent a false command, strictly ordering Commander Drake not to attack the Spanish. This, of course, was just a deception, giving her cover to deny any involvement in the mission. Now, before we go any further, I want to be able to show you these books, Heroes for Freedom, these stories we're talking about are contained in these manuals. This is volume 1, and this is volume 2, and these are available now. Volume 3 will soon be available as well. Francis Drake sailed his force, which included several thousand sailors and soldiers, unnoticed into the Bay of Cadiz, surprising the Spanish fleet, including many partly finished and unprotected warships, destroying, sinking, and plundering 39 ships of King Philip's navy before the ships could even get out of Spanish waters. Drake's mission was so successful, in fact, that it forced King Philip. He had to delay his planned invasion of England that year. He had to wait for a full year to refit and rebuild. Also fortunate during that year's delay, the Spanish naval commander, a favorite of King Philip, and who was to lead the Armada against England, very capable commander. His name was Alvaro de Bazan, took ill and he died just before the Armada was to set sail. Bazan was considered the finest naval commander in Europe, in fact, having led the Christian fleet, called the Holy League, to a stunning victory over the larger Ottoman Empire's navy at the Battle of Lepanto a decade or so before. Then, what was a political appointment, so this commander is gone, the king replaces Bazan with an inexperienced and incompetent Alonso Perez de Guzman, a well-connected Spanish aristocrat and member of the royal family. This delaying action was critical, in fact. It gave Elizabeth and Drake the opportunity to prepare, train, and build up their naval and land forces. Still, that next summer in 1588, the Spanish Armada finally was ready. It sailed for England with 130 warships and 18,000 men. This was the largest single fleet ever assembled by a European nation up to that time, by one nation. In fact, Philip and his many advisors all believed the Spanish Armada was invincible. Standing against them was a confident Sir Francis Drake. Though a poor son of a failed farmer, he also understood that he had prepared all his life for this very moment. He had trained his men. He'd built and fitted his warships to perfection. Most of all, he believed that God would stand with him and with their Virgin Queen. The Spanish planned to rush the English in their famous battle lines and smash through the English ships quickly. Of course, they outnumbered the English. And then they would clear the English Channel for an invasion by Spanish troops who would be ferried across the Channel from Spanish-occupied Holland. Then they would march on London and Greenwich Palace, capture Elizabeth, and they'd execute her and place a Catholic king over England. Philip had promised that before the summer's end, a sovereign loyal to the Pope, and to the Spanish, of course, would rule in England. Drake seemed to understand the stakes, and there was a lot here that needed to be considered. Often called a Protestant zealot, Drake and his men would fight to the death if necessary. Her famous words that rallied the men were something that needs to be mentioned in this story. Because as the Armada approached, Elizabeth stood with Drake on the heights overlooking the Channel. They could see the massive Spanish fleet approaching. English men and boys, all carrying a hodgepodge of weaponry, rallied round their queen as she sat atop her white steed, dressed in flawless, bristling silver armor. She spoke to her struggling, fear-filled army, for each man knew the brutal reputation of the Spanish military, both on land and on sea. She said to her men in so many words, quote, "My loving people, I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king and a king of England, and I hold foul scorn that any prince of Europe or Spain should dare invade the borders of my realm. For I myself will take up arms against this tyrant. Let tyrants fear, for I have always so behaved myself, that under God I have placed my greatest strength, and also my safeguard in the loyal arms and hearts of my subjects. Yes, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God, for my kingdom, and for my people, my honor and my blood, even in the dust. And by your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over these enemies of God, of my kingdom, and of my people." Unquote. These were the fighting words of perhaps the most skilled female political leader and statesman in the history of Europe and the West. More so, one of the world's most significant history-changing heroes. Yet to most people today, she's been practically forgotten. As expected, the battle commenced in the English Channel. Drake and his men took full advantage of the weather. With great skill, they exploited the large, awkward, and slow Spanish vessels. They were deadly, but they were slow because of the way they were designed. And the British, with lighter, faster ships, outmaneuvered them. And they used a weapon that has been used from the beginning of time, but it worked particularly well here, called fire ships, or hell burners, as the English called them. And using them and the way that they did, the Spanish Armada was defeated soundly. It ended up limping back to Spain and lost nearly half its ships and many thousands of men. To other Europeans, this victory was considered a miracle, for no one believed that England could stand against the wealthy and brutal Spanish kingdom. But more so, particularly because England was just beginning to rise as a nation, as a kingdom. But more so, this was the beginning of the so-called Elizabethan era, where invention, arts, and sciences and growth would sweep England, as well as the rapid rise and spread of Protestant enlightenment and influence. Groups such as the Pilgrims and the Puritans would rise up, their profound religious movement spreading to the newly established American colonies. And the British Empire, for good and bad, would begin its expansion throughout the world, impacting millions yet unborn. Elizabeth was a powerful supporter of the sciences, the arts, including the works of Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare. She encouraged the entrepreneurial spirit and greater innovation and invention. The Elizabethan era became a time of peace, prosperity, and union in England. These events, by extension, also influenced Greater Europe. At the time, England was not so secretly supporting the Dutch, who were occupied by the Spanish Empire. Spain had conquered them some years previous. Of course, the Dutch wanted to destroy and expel the brutal Spanish, but England was trying to help them to do just that. Without Drake's and Elizabeth's military and political muscle, as well as their secret help with arms and funding, and as I mentioned, Elizabeth had a very good spy network throughout Europe. The Dutch were incapable, without their help, of carrying out their resistance movement against the Spanish. But eventually, the Dutch succeeded, and with help, they drove out Spain. But that's another story, and we'll talk about that another time, perhaps. Let's talk about the historical, vital importance of England's victory over the Spanish Armada. In essence, had the Spanish under King Philip II been victorious over Elizabeth's England, marching on her capital and overthrowing and beheading her, as they planned, Protestantism in its infancy in England, a very special kind of Protestantism, in fact, would have ceased to exist. A Protestant strain that would shortly go on to populate a revolutionary America. In fact, it would encourage, from the pulpit, a revolutionary America. Another wonderful story we could discuss. An America that would mature, improve, but more so change the course of the history of freedom. If the Spanish had conquered London, a bloodbath would have ensued as Philip rooted out what he hated most, any hint of Protestant belief, as well as independently minded free thinkers. He despised England's uniquely creative environment, particularly the arts and sciences that he thought challenged Catholicism, which was blossoming under Elizabeth, Protestantism, and rapidly spreading to other areas of Europe. Also, entrepreneurism and financial investment were combining to create unheard of wealth from, as they said, seemingly nothing. Of course, that was not true, but it was amazing how much that magnified it. In the arts, Christopher Marlowe, as well as young William Shakespeare, who was kind of about a half a generation younger than Elizabeth, and their unique works were encouraged and supported by Elizabeth. Aggressive and courageous explorers and privateers, as we talked about Sir Francis Drake, could pop up any place at any time, carrying out piracy on the open seas with impunity against England's enemies, and partnering, not so secretly, of course, with the Virgin Queen. She had a stake in many of these activities. But more so, during this time, the expansion of the British Navy, which would go on to overwhelm much of the rest of the world and establish an empire the likes the world had never seen. The same England, encouraged by Christian leaders and backed up by the might of the British Navy, would also help to put an end to slavery, seeking out slave ships on the high seas and forcing many powerful slavers to end their lucrative profession or be arrested and hung. Looking back, if the Spanish had been capable of defeating Drake and Elizabeth while conquering England, they would have transported to England tens of thousands of Spanish-speaking settlers, which was often the case. Had this occurred, not only would the Spanish be perhaps, the Spanish language be perhaps the most widely spoken language today, but more importantly, English North America would have been settled probably much later, because the Spanish had other things they were doing in Latin America, by Spanish-speaking Catholics in North America. Then North America would look more, I think, like Latin America does today. Protestantism would have been crushed, certainly in England, along with the unique cultural, political, and scientific advances that English Protestantism produced. Had this occurred, as mentioned, the history of the Americas and the world, we are certain, would today be unrecognizable. The Pilgrims, who sought political asylum first in the Netherlands, just prior to sailing to North America would have certainly been wiped out. A sect such as the Pilgrims or the Puritans, the Spanish would have finished off. We can only estimate how many key innovations and explorations would have been curtailed and limited by the ponderous bureaucratic state that was the Spanish Empire at the time. Certainly, had this all taken place, America's history would be vastly different. These precise historical what-ifs must be considered by any serious historian. Elizabeth's and Sir Francis Drake's victory over a powerful, unbeaten enemy, many at the time believed was a miracle. I believe it too, especially considering the wealth and the experience, the war experience and firepower of the Spanish. Again, we see how often in the past one man or woman alone can and does have a pivotal impact upon history. Yet too often, such heroes today are ignored or taken for granted. America's history is a broad and colorful mosaic of inspiring men and women whose lives have much to teach us, and obviously not all are Americans. Destined by God to become a nation under divine covenant, America was populated by a moral and capable people from all lands everywhere. But at first primarily from the land of England under the tutelage of great leaders like Elizabeth I. The hero, Sir Francis Drake, was an exception, very much an exception in his world. He rose to power and influence from the lowliest of beginnings, fighting against unbelievable odds every day of his life. Though the herd tried to hold him back, to get him to sit down and shut up, essentially, he would not listen. In fact, the more he was hated and attacked, the stronger he seemed to get. He knew that deep inside he had the smarts, the work ethic and the fight and the faith, and the dogged determination to succeed where everyone else had failed. In the immortal words of Thomas Hobbes, quote, "Life is nasty, brutish, and short." Sir Francis Drake shows us that even though he was a flawed man, as we all are, yet he believed that Providence had a mission for him. He was destined for greatness. His stalwart, unbeaten, faith-driven persona helped create the conditions for success, for his desires, for the most part, were just. I mean, obviously he was not perfect, but he did a lot of incredible things. He determined to protect his homeland in its tender beginnings, to ensure that the Christian liberty, individual freedom, would not die beneath the tyrant's crushing heel. These are lessons that we and our children, I think, need to know. One man or woman can make a difference. Yes, heroes are rare creatures in our world, but they do not have to be. Today, we are blessed to be born in a country where you may rise as high as your faith, intellect, work ethic, and grit will take you. Truly, the American dream is alive and well. It's gifted to each of us by the heroes and heroines of our illustrious past. Please, my friends, ponder this exceptional history of Sir Francis Drake, but also of Elizabeth I, to see how we might pick up the gauntlet of freedom today to make our own heroic past and future. I'm Rick Robison, and this is Heroes for Freedom.